Hey everyone, it's James. Welcome back to Urban Jungle MSP. I am really excited to talk to you today about some of my easiest care plants that are not Hoyas. As most of you know, I am hot for Hoya. They are my favorite genus right now. But I was at happy hour with a few of my friends from college and they mentioned, like, James, you should probably just do a video for people like us who don't know anything about plants but want to keep a green environment. So I said, you know what, that's a really good idea, so that's what I'm gonna do today. I was originally going to repot my Hoya Matilda and Hoya Serpens cuttings because they are ready, but that will have to come later this week because I just realized that I am completely out of potting soil. I have my orchid bark and my perlite and my leca, but I am out of potting soil. Getting into the video, I have pulled a few plants from my collection that honestly I don't think about. So I'm just gonna go over some of the basic care requirements for them and talk to you a little bit about how you can incorporate them in your space. So let's get started. The first plant that I wanna talk about is the ZZ plant. This plant lives about 4 feet away diagonally from a south-facing window, and it's done really well for me this year. I actually have 2 different varieties potted up into this pot. The larger one is just your classic ZZ plant, and then I have this smaller variety, and I don't honestly know what the name of it is, but you can see that the growth habit is a little bit more compact than the larger leaves on this matured plant that I have in here. I had this potted into a much smaller container initially, and then I potted it up into a larger container, and it took so long to grow. These are one of the plants that if you pot it into a bigger container, it's gonna really work on its root system before pushing out new growth. At least that's what my experience has been. But this summer, I noticed a lot of growth. There were actually 3 of these fronds that came in, and I believe these 2 larger ones right here, and I believe this one is new as well, are the 3 that grew for me this summer. ZZ plants are amazing, first of all. They are very low care, low maintenance plants, and basically what they do, they have these really thick stems, as you can see right here. These thick stems store water, which means that they don't need to be watered super often. I probably water this plant about once every 2 months when it's completely dry, and it's super happy. And it doesn't need a ton of light. It's actually one of your lower light plants. Any plant that I say low light doesn't mean no light. It still needs to get some type of ambient light or artificial light in some way, either coming from like a grow light, because plants can process light differently and they see light differently than what we do. So plants can utilize basically any band in the spectrum of light, but they really like red and blue. And so that's why you see a lot of grow lights being purple, because it gives off those rays that they need. But anyways, so these guys you'll see very often in like shopping centers or in offices because they can do really well. They're really low maintenance. Like I said, I water this guy when it's completely dry and it seems really happy. You might notice that there's some little like yellowy bits in here, which is like normal with any plant. And I want to make sure that everybody knows, like, your plants aren't going to look perfect all the time, especially this season that we're in right now going into winter. Some of your plants are probably going to suffer because they're not getting as much light as they normally do. So you're going to have to just kind of adjust and see what they need and really work with them. But this is one of the plants that I highly recommend for a beginner. It requires very little care. It's beautiful. It's got this awesome structure, and it's one of the plants that I don't really think a whole lot about but really appreciate having in my collection. So that's the ZZ plant. Okay, the next plant that I want to talk about is the peace lily. I have had a peace lily in my collection for a really long time. You probably recognize a peace lily from a funeral. And they're sent a lot as funeral or sympathy plants because they have really beautiful white blossoms, which I'm sure you have seen before. But they are just a very hardy plant. I actually just watered this yesterday because it wilted for me quite a bit, and this is one of the plants that can tolerate a little bit of neglect, and it's great for anybody that doesn't necessarily know when to water, because this plant, as you can see, it gets really droopy, and it's still recovering from the wilt that it was experiencing over the weekend. But it tells you when it needs water because it starts looking sad, and then you water it, and the next day it perks right back up. This is also a pretty low light plant because these dark green leaves produce a lot of chlorophyll. So I have this about 6 to 8 feet away from a south-facing window, and it does super well for me. It hasn't been pushing out many blooms just because I think that it's a little stressed since it doesn't have bright light, bright indirect light. It gets more ambient light, but you can see that it's still growing, it's still producing foliage, it's just not pushing out blooms. But I think in the spring, once I get a little bit more light into my apartment, right, like I said, right now it's wintertime, it's getting darker during the day, I think this is going to start doing a little bit better. Plus, I don't water this super frequently, but with the peace lily, it's one of the plants you also are going to want to water thoroughly once you do water it. I just highly recommend this for a beginner as well. This is a great plant because, like I said, it tells you when it needs its water. You can put this in a relatively unlit environment. If you have it closer to a window in a north-facing environment, it'll do well. If you have it relatively close to a window in an east or a south-facing window, it'll do fine. With west, you have to be careful just because west light is usually pretty intense since it's in the afternoon. So you want to make sure that it doesn't get too much direct light. Otherwise, these leaves, since they're pretty tender, could burn. But this is an awesome beginner plant, the peace lily. If you want a plant that is going to bloom for you, this is a great option too. Just give it a little bit more bright indirect light and it'll just be super happy for you. So, the peace lily. If you follow me on Instagram, you will have seen this plant. This is my lemon lime maranta, and it's also called the prayer plant. And now, this plant is of the Marantaceae family, and it does this really cool thing at night. When it gets dark, its leaves fold up, kind of like hands in prayer, it folds. So anyway, this plant I have about 2 feet away from an east-facing window, and it has just been super happy. You can see it's putting out just a bunch of new growth. It pushes out leaves in these little spirals, and then they unfurl, and it's just beautiful. I think that this is one of my favorite varieties of prayer plant. It has this really striking lime green and this dark green contrasting, and I just think it's a really interesting looking plant. I also have the red maranta variety, but I tend to prefer this. And this guy I actually got at a grocery store. I got this at my local Cub Foods for about $15, and it's been just delightful for me ever since I got it earlier this summer. And I honestly water this one about once every 3-ish weeks. And when I water it really thoroughly. I take it out of the plant hanger that I have it on, and I water it until water runs through the bottom. And that's pretty much the watering routine you're going to want to do with the majority of your plants, especially your tropicals. The best way to check to see when you should water your plant is honestly just to stick your finger in, and if the top couple inches of soil are dry, you're going to want to give it a thorough watering. I tend to look and watch for when the plant tells me it needs to be watered. Basically, when these leaves start getting limp and don't have this like firmness where it just springs back, if it's looking like really just limp and it doesn't spring back, that tells me that the plant needs to be watered. For anybody who's newer to plants, it's going to take a little bit of trial and error to get to that place. I would recommend picking the maranta up. It does really well in bright indirect environments. Like I said, I have this pretty close to an east-facing window and it gets a lot of morning sun, but I've seen these just do really well in a lot of other environments too. So you can see this foliage is just so striking. So if you're looking for a nice structural plant and you're newer to the houseplant market, I would really recommend trying this, whether it's the lemon lime variety, whether it's the red variety of prayer plant. I have a girlfriend who has hers in her bathroom, and they love the extra humidity, so that's a really great environment for it as well. But honestly, I don't do a whole lot of care with this plant other than watering it every few weeks, and it just seems to be really happy. That is the lemon lime maranta. Alright, the next plant that I want to talk about is the pothos. Now, you have seen these everywhere. Your grandma probably had them, you're going to see them in office buildings, in shopping centers, like wherever you go where you see plants in more commercial environments, you will see the pothos, or epipremnum. These guys just don't stop growing. I have this it's like 6 feet away from a south-facing window in my kitchen, and it honestly just pretty much gets ambient light. And you can see this thing is still pushing, it just pushes out new growth. It's really steady. It doesn't grow as quickly as some of my other plants that are closer to the window, but you can have this pretty deep in the interior of your home and it'll do really well for you. This I purchased as the Jade Pothos variety because it's all green, but I'm getting some variegation on some of these leaves, which leads me to believe that this is probably a golden pothos that was just grown in a lower light condition from the grower. And honestly, I've taken so many cuttings off of this plant. They're really easy to root and water because they have these little adventitious nodes on their stem, and basically those, if you just pop them in water, are going to form roots and you can just pot them right up. This is a plant that you can get that's going to tell you when it needs to be watered, because like I said, it's going to look a little droopy. These leaves won't be as springy as they are. It'll just look kind of sad, so you'll know when to water it. And just because this one doesn't get as much light as some of my other plants, I water it probably every 2 to 3 weeks. And then when I do, I water it really thoroughly. But as you can see, I have this in a container that doesn't have drainage. So you want to be a little bit more sparing with your watering, especially if your container doesn't have drainage. And I really wouldn't recommend that, especially if you're a beginner. You're going to want some type of container that allows water to drain through, because the risk of you introducing root rot happens really easily, especially if there's water sitting at the bottom of a container. So it takes a little bit more experience to know your plants. So I don't water this one super frequently. When I do, I water it nice and thoroughly, but I have enough perlite and soil amendment so that the soil can really breathe. But with a pothos, they are so resilient that you're not gonna have to really worry about it too much. So I highly recommend this plant. There are so many different pothos varieties. I can think of 5 off the top of my head, and they are all pretty inexpensive. So you can find this at your local Lowe's, Home Depot, any garden center will have these on hand. They are your standard classic beginner house plant, and I highly recommend having them, especially if you just want to have some splashes of foliage in your apartment or your house and you don't have a ton of light. These are going to be great options. So this is the Jade Pothos. The last plant that I want to talk with you about is this Syngonium, or arrowhead vine. This is a plant that I got a couple of years ago, and you can see from this foliage, it gets kind of pink if it's in higher light. Right now, I have this pulled pretty far away from my south-facing window, so it gets more ambient light. Any plant that has variegation or has different colors like this lighter pink, that's going to come out more strongly when it's exposed to brighter light. Since I have this plant in a bit of a lower light situation, I am not getting as strong of pinks. During the summer, this plant was putting out a lot of pink growth, and it's reverting back a little bit now to more green, but in the spring and during the summer again, it is going to produce a little bit more of that beautiful splash of color that I'm used to. But this plant has been super steady for me. I have it also in a non-draining container, so I let this get pretty dry before I water it again. But this is one of the plants that you can also keep closer into the interior of your home without giving it too much bright light. Syngoniums are super resilient. They really can take a lot of neglect, and they're also going to tell you when they need to be watered. They're going to be that droopy presence where the leaves aren't very springy. They'll just kind of look a little sad, and then once you water them in about a day, they'll go right back to their former selves where they're looking a little bit more erect and structured. So not to worry. I've had this, like I said, for a couple of years, and it's been just like super stable. It's one plant that I don't really have to think that much about. If you have it near an east or a little bit further away from a south-facing window, it'll do just great for you. And the same thing with watering. Just let the plant tell you when it needs to be watered and then water thoroughly. And if you can, keep it in a container that has drainage, that's even better. So this is just a really standard plant that you can get pretty much anywhere at any garden center. Honestly, I think I bought this plant from Home Depot and it's been totally fine for me. I would recommend any plants that you get from like a Lowe's, Home Depot, or any other like national garden center to treat them with either neem oil or insecticidal soap, something to just spray the leaves down with. I've had some trouble in the past buying plants from those places because they are often exposed to pests. So whether that's mealybugs, thrips, spider mites. Spider mites is something that I've dealt with in the past, and it's really hard to overcome, I would just treat it when you get it so that you kind of hit the ground running, and then inspect for pests as you go. But otherwise, this Syngonium has been super easy to take care of. It's really beautiful, especially when you get some more of that pink coming through on the foliage. But even if you don't, the leaves are really beautiful. I think that this guy wants a little bit more humidity because the leaves aren't unfurling as well, but going into winter, all of your plants are going to be not as ideal conditions unless you have a humidifier running by them. But for any beginner, this is going to be a really great plant. So those are 5 plants that I highly recommend for beginner houseplant owners. If you are somebody who has not kept a plant in the past and just want to get your feet wet, I would highly recommend trying out those 5 varieties. They are really resilient. They are the types of plants that are going to tell you when they want to be watered, and then once you water them thoroughly, they will spring right back. If you have any questions, feel free to leave me a comment below. I do my best to answer all the comments that I receive. Otherwise, follow me on Instagram at UrbanJungleMSP. Like this video and subscribe to my channel, and I will be back very soon with another houseplant related video. Hope you have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.